I never believed in ghosts, demons, or anything supernatural. I was a man of logic, grounded in reality, until the night I took the job as a night guard at the old Whitmore Mansion in rural Nebraska, a place so swallowed in shadows, so drenched in ancient whispers and secrets, that even the locals refused to speak its name after sunset. And now, I wish I had listened to them, because what I saw, what I heard, what I felt in that house wasn't just terrifying. It was inhuman, it was wrong, and it still follows me in my sleep, even though I quit that cursed job long ago. Because when I first walked through those creaking gates and heard the gravel crunch beneath my boots under the cold silence of that black, moonless night, I had no idea that this mansion didn't just require guarding. It demanded obedience. It demanded blood. And most of all, it demanded that I follow 6 strange and terrifying rules. Rules that weren't suggestions or protocols or outdated instructions, but living, breathing laws carved into the bones of the house itself. And now I can't escape the feeling that something came back with me, something I can't see, something that moves behind my shadow even when I'm standing still. And if you're brave enough to hear what I endured in that place, you need to listen all the way until the end, because only by understanding the final truth will you comprehend what the 6th rule really meant and why breaking it cost me everything. People always assume that being a night guard is a boring job. Just sitting in a chair, watching cameras, sipping coffee, and occasionally walking the halls to make sure no one's breaking in. But the Whitmore Mansion wasn't just another abandoned estate. It was a decaying colossus standing alone in the heart of nowhere, surrounded by 1,000 acres of wheat fields that never swayed in the wind and didn't make a single sound, even when the breeze passed over them. As if the land itself had learned not to move, not to breathe, not to draw attention to the thing that lived at the heart of it all. And on my very first night, I understood that this job was not about protecting the property from outsiders. It was about protecting the outside world from what was locked inside. The man who hired me, Mr. Ellery, a wiry, gray-skinned man with sunken eyes and fingers that never stopped trembling, met me just outside the wrought iron gate at dusk, and before I could ask a single question about the job, the pay, or the hours, he handed me a folded piece of yellow paper, its corners curled, its surface cold like it had just been pulled from a frozen grave. And with a voice that sounded like dry leaves scraping across an attic floor, he said, "Read these rules slowly, and never ever forget them. You must follow them exactly, or this house will notice." I thought he was joking at first, just a weird local with a flair for the dramatic. But the way he looked past me into the windows of the house, as if expecting to see something there already staring back, made my stomach tighten and my mouth go dry, and I unfolded the paper with shaking hands as the last light of the sun disappeared behind the dead trees lining the gravel road. And this is what was written on that paper, every word burned into my mind forever, every line colder than the last, each one a chain around my neck I didn't realize I was already wearing. Rule 1. Do not enter the library under any circumstances, no matter what you hear from inside it. If you hear knocking, ignore it. If you hear your name whispered through the keyhole, do not answer. The thing in the library knows your voice now. Rule 2. Between the hours of your patrol, you will hear footsteps that do not match your own. Do not stop. Do not turn around. Do not acknowledge them. If you do, they will follow you home. Rule 3. At exactly one point during your shift, you will hear the ringing of the servant's bell from the West Wing. There are no servants. Do not go to the West Wing. Let it ring. It always stops eventually. Rule 4. If you see the portrait in the grand hallway, change its expression. Keep walking and do not comment on it. Do not make eye contact with the painting. Do not speak while in its presence. It listens. Rule 5. If you must use the restroom, use only the one in the basement hallway marked with a red door. Any other door may open, but you must not step inside. The house sometimes pretends to be helpful. Rule 6. If you hear the front door open, even though it is locked and bolted from the inside, and you hear someone step into the foyer and call your name in a voice that sounds almost right, but not quite, do not answer, do not investigate, and above all else, do not hide. Go to the nearest window and wait. It always leaves when it sees you watching. By the time I finished reading, my hands were trembling, my throat dry, and when I looked up, Mr. Ellery was already walking away without a word, disappearing down the gravel road like a man escaping a fire, leaving me alone with the keys to the mansion, a flashlight, a thermos of lukewarm coffee, and a list of rules that felt less like safety instructions and more like warnings carved into an executioner's wall. But still, I forced myself to take the first step through the threshold of the Whitmore mansion, pretending that this was just another job, that the cold air on my neck was just a draft and not a breath, that the strange hum in the walls wasn't whispering in a language I almost understood, because denial was easier than turning around and admitting that I had already made the biggest mistake of my life. The mansion itself was a vast, hollow corpse of a building, 4 stories tall, with ceilings so high they vanished into shadows, doors that refused to stay open or shut completely, and staircases that creaked under my weight like they were tired of holding humans, filled with rooms that hadn't been touched in over 50 years, covered in layers of dust that somehow looked disturbed, as if someone or something had been walking these halls every night for decades. And as I began my first patrol, flashlight cutting through the murk, the silence was so thick it seemed to press against my ears, broken only by distant groans from the foundation, soft creaks in the walls, and the occasional scurry of something too large to be a rat, but too fast to be anything else. I walked the halls with the rules whispering in the back of my mind like a second conscience. And though I told myself I was being paranoid, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me, not just from the portraits or the cracked windows, but from inside itself, like it was alive in a way that had nothing to do with biology, more like an ancient awareness that had grown teeth in the dark and was waiting, always waiting, for me to break just one rule. I passed the library once, saw the heavy double doors bound with a thick chain and a padlock. And just as I stepped beyond it, I heard it, one soft knock, like a fingertip tapping the wood from inside, followed by a low, slow whisper that rasped my name in a voice that sounded like mine, but stretched and decayed like it had been buried and dug back up again. And even though my heart was pounding so hard I thought it would crack my ribs, I kept walking. I didn't answer, and I didn't look back, because Rule 1 was already being tested. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just a strange job with superstitious instructions. This was something ancient and cruel and real, and it had already noticed me. I don't know how I made it through the next hallway without collapsing under the weight of the dread crushing my chest like a hand tightening its grip around my lungs. But somehow, I kept my feet moving, even though every instinct in my body screamed for me to run, to scream, to get out of that house before whatever was behind that locked library door found a way out. Yet I knew deep in my bones that there would be no escape. Not now. Not after it had spoken my name in my own decaying voice. Because the house had marked me, and the moment I crossed the threshold and agreed to follow its rules, I had stepped into something much older than any contract or job description. Something watching me from the rotting walls, breathing through the vents, dragging its claws softly across the floor just out of sight. And as I continued my patrol, flashlight trembling in my hand, I felt the air around me grow colder, heavier, charged with the kind of silence that wasn't just the absence of sound, but the presence of attention. Like something was leaning in close, listening, waiting for me to break one of the rules so it could finally act. I reached the end of the east corridor, passing under the looming archway that led into the grand hallway, and although the flickering chandelier overhead barely lit the massive space before me, I could already feel the weight of the portrait's presence long before I saw it. And the second I stepped across the threshold, I felt it hit me. An overwhelming, sickening pressure in my chest, like standing too close to a bonfire but feeling cold instead of heat. And as my eyes adjusted to the dim glow, I saw it hanging at the far end of the hall, larger than I remembered, a looming oil painting of a man with pale skin and hollow eyes, dressed in a blood-dark suit that seemed to shift shades in the low light. And even though I swore the last time I passed this way, the painting had shown him with a straight face and lifeless stare, now his lips were curled ever so slightly, not into a smile, but something worse, a smirk, like he was amused, like he knew something I didn't. And I remembered Rule 4 immediately. clutching it in my mind like a life preserver in deep water. Do not comment. Do not make eye contact. Do not speak while in its presence. And I lowered my gaze and kept walking, each step slow and deliberate, my breath shallow, every nerve screaming at me to run. And I swear I felt his painted eyes follow me the entire way. And though my mouth stayed shut, my mind screamed inside my skull like a caged animal, begging for this part of the hall to end. The second I cleared the hallway, the pressure lifted from my chest like a phantom hand withdrawing its grip, and I staggered into the next corridor, where the walls were narrower and lined with crooked sconces that spat out weak flames, casting shadows that twitched and danced with too much life. And just as I rounded the corner to begin my next loop through the second floor, I heard it, footsteps behind me, light but deliberate, mismatched with mine, the soft scrape of leather against the floor, spaced just seconds after each of my own steps, and my heart froze because I remembered Rule 2 instantly. If you hear footsteps that do not match your own, do not stop, do not turn around, do not acknowledge them. And in that moment, I felt the raw, primal instinct of prey being stalked, not by something human, but by something that had watched and hunted in total darkness for centuries. Something that mimicked just enough of human behavior to lure you into thinking it could be reasoned with before it struck. I increased my pace slightly, not running, but walking fast enough that my breathing turned shallow and quick, and I could hear the mismatched footsteps continuing behind me, closer now, closer than before. And even though I couldn't see it, I felt it, like breath on my neck, like fingers reaching just beyond the hem of my shirt. And I kept walking, eyes fixed ahead, afraid that if I so much as blinked too long, it would be enough for the thing behind me to close the gap and take me. And in that awful, suspended moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own blood roaring in my ears and the dry creak of the floorboards under invisible weight, until I finally turned the corner into the servants' hallway, where the sound of the mismatched steps stopped abruptly, as if the thing had paused at the edge, watching, deciding whether to follow, but bound by something unseen, and the absence of its presence was somehow worse than its closeness, because now I didn't know where it had gone. And then the bell rang. One sharp chime echoed through the silence like a scream trapped in a glass jar, vibrating through the beams and floorboards and my skull all at once. And I knew without looking at my watch that I was standing near the west wing, and that the sound had come from deep inside it. And even though every bone in my body urged me to go to it, to check, to see if someone else was in the mansion who shouldn't be, I knew better, because Rule 3 was as clear as the others. When the servants' bell rings, do not go to the west wing, because there are no servants. And even if you think you hear someone in distress, even if you hear your own voice crying out from that direction, you must let it ring, because it always stops eventually. So I stood there, rooted to the floor, fists clenched, heart racing, as the bell rang again and again, louder and more desperate each time, until the ringing turned into something else, into a sound that almost resembled laughter, low and broken and echoing through the walls, like something was enjoying the way I was shaking, enjoying the fact that I couldn't move, couldn't speak, could only listen and endure. And then, just as quickly as it began, it stopped, cut off mid-ring, like a string had been yanked from its throat. And the silence that followed felt worse than the sound, deeper and hungrier. And I backed away slowly, step by step, afraid that if I turned my back to the west wing entirely, it would call out again. And this time, not with a bell, but with footsteps. By the time I reached the back stairwell leading toward the basement hallway, I was soaked in sweat despite the cold, and I knew I couldn't hold out much longer without using the restroom, even though the idea of being in a closed space in this house made my stomach churn. But I remembered Rule 5, and I remembered it exactly. If you must use the restroom, use only the one in the basement hallway marked with a red door, because any other door may open, but you must not step inside, since the house sometimes pretends to be helpful. The stairwell groaned under my weight, each step down into the dark belly of the house stretching longer than it should have, like the descent was unnatural, time dilated, and as I reached the bottom and turned into the hallway, the temperature dropped sharply, my breath fogging in the stale air, and there it was, the red door at the very end, chipped and splintered around the frame, but unmistakably red, and I forced myself to ignore the 4 other doors I passed on the way, each of which creaked slightly open as I neared them, each revealing a little more than it should have. A glimpse of a hand resting on a sink, twitching slightly, a blackened silhouette crouched on the toilet with no face, a sound like water dripping, even though the faucet wasn't running. And I kept walking, eyes locked on the red door, and only when I touched its rusted knob did the other doors slam shut behind me all at once, like children caught misbehaving. Inside, the red door restroom was cold and lifeless, but empty, and I did what I had to do as quickly as possible, not daring to look at anything too closely, not daring to stay a second longer than needed. And when I stepped back out into the hallway, it was quiet again, but the quiet no longer felt empty. It felt loaded, and I knew then this house was winding tighter, like a rope around the throat, waiting for the 6th rule to be tested. The hallway didn't feel the same as when I had walked down it just minutes before. And while the stone floor remained still beneath my boots, and the walls still wore their peeling wallpaper, like a corpse wearing its last skin, there was an undeniable tension in the air now. Something invisible but choking, like an unseen audience had taken their seats just beyond the walls, watching with breathless anticipation for what would happen next. And as I climbed the stairs back to the main floor, the house no longer creaked with age, but with intent, each groan of the wood beneath me sounding less like wear and more like warning, as if the mansion was waking up, realizing I was still following the rules, still resisting the little invitations it was throwing my way, and it was not pleased about it. I didn't want to go near the grand hallway again, not after what I had seen in the painting earlier that evening. The subtle curl of its lip, the almost imperceptible blink of its dead painted eyes. But my patrol path took me there again, whether I wanted it or not. And as I approached, the air grew warmer, not in a comforting way, but in a suffocating, heavy way, like the breath of something massive lingering just overhead, unseen and patient. And when I rounded the corner and the portrait came into view once more, I slowed my steps, not because I wanted to, but because my legs felt like they were moving through wet cement. Like the very atmosphere around that cursed artwork was thicker, meaner, heavier. The painting was of a woman, tall and regal, in a black gown that seemed too modern for the age of the house. Her face long and pale and angular, with eyes that were meant to be looking to the side. But now, they were looking straight at me, dead on, like they had turned in their sockets to follow my movement. And though my breath caught in my chest and my vision pulsed at the edges, I kept walking, exactly as Rule 4 had instructed. Not speaking, not looking into those eyes again, not even daring to blink as I passed beneath the painting. And it was only when I had put several feet between me and it that I heard the sound. A soft scraping, like fingernails against canvas, slow and deliberate, dragging behind me, and I knew, without turning, that its expression had changed again. That if I so much as glanced over my shoulder, I'd see her mouth open in a scream, or her hand raised to point at me, or something else far worse than I could imagine. Something real. But I didn't look, and I didn't speak, because I still had to survive. The rest of the main floor was dimly lit, the chandeliers swaying gently, even though there was no draft, no open windows, no breath of wind, and as I continued my patrol, I began to feel the pressure again. Not on my chest this time, but behind me. Something dragging at my steps like a presence just out of view. And I remembered Rule 2, remembered it with such clarity that my hands began to sweat despite the cold. I was hearing footsteps again, soft at first, like someone barefoot was pacing the same rhythm behind me, never overlapping my stride, always one beat behind, always staying close but not quite catching up. And the moment I became aware of it, I felt its attention latch onto me like a leech, felt the sharp pinch of awareness like a needle sliding under the skin. I didn't stop walking, even though every instinct in me screamed to spin around and confront whatever was behind me, to chase it off, to know. But Rule 2 said never to look, never to acknowledge, and I forced myself forward, eyes locked on the distant hallway light, jaw clenched so hard it ached, every muscle in my body stiff with fear as the footsteps grew louder, closer, like someone was leaning forward as they walked, neck extended, trying to taste the air I left behind. And the closer I got to the end of the hallway, The more the sound changed, it became wet, like bare feet squelching across a blood-slicked floor, and I could swear I heard breathing now, shallow and damp, right at my ear. But I didn't turn, not even when I felt something brush my jacket. I don't remember exactly how I made it into the drawing room, but once I passed the threshold, the footsteps stopped, and I stumbled forward, gasping, sweating, my knees buckling as I collapsed onto the nearest armchair, and I sat there for a long time, heart pounding, head spinning, the taste of iron thick on my tongue like I'd been biting it without realizing. And the fire in the hearth lit itself just then, flames crackling without kindling, throwing jagged shadows across the walls. And that's when I heard it, clear as a bell, literally, the sharp, metallic jingle of the servant's bell from the west wing. I froze, my eyes darting toward the archway that led in that direction, the sound ringing again, this time longer, more insistent, and I counted them. 1, 2, 3 chimes, steady and distant, but real. And with each one, a pressure began to build behind my eyes, like the sound itself was vibrating in my skull, trying to force my body to move toward it, to obey it, to break Rule 3. But I clenched my fists, dug my nails into my palms until I felt skin break, and I whispered aloud, to myself, to whatever might be listening, "There are no servants. There are no servants. There are no servants." Like a mantra, like a shield. And I stayed seated, stayed still, until the bell finally stopped ringing, and the silence rolled back in like a wave of relief soaked in terror. But that silence was short-lived, because I heard something then that froze every drop of blood in my veins, the unmistakable sound of the front door unlocking itself. I hadn't touched it. No one else was in the house. I knew that bolt had been secured, the heavy chain drawn across, and yet I heard it. The slow, deliberate scrape of metal sliding free, the creak of the door's old hinges giving way to weight, and then came the sound of footsteps, just 2, into the foyer, heavy and dragging slightly, like whoever had entered wasn't walking quite right. And then it said my name, but it didn't say it like someone I knew. It said it like someone trying to remember how to say it, like it was shaping the syllables around a mouthful of teeth that didn't fit, and the voice, God help me, the voice was almost mine. Almost. I didn't move, I didn't breathe. But Rule 6 was pounding in my mind like a war drum. Do not answer, do not investigate, and above all else, do not hide. And I forced my legs to move, to carry me toward the nearest window, heart thudding like a ticking bomb. And when I reached it and looked out into the dark lawn beyond, I could feel the thing standing just behind me in the foyer, waiting for me to call out, to come closer, to hide from it. But I didn't. I stood there, staring out, trembling, refusing to speak, refusing to move away. And after what felt like hours, but must have only been seconds, I heard it retreat, one dragging step at a time, until the front door creaked again and closed. It left, and I was still alive. But I wasn't alone. Not anymore. And I knew I had followed every rule so far, but the house wasn't playing fair anymore. It was adapting. It wanted me to slip, and I was running out of night. I didn't move from that spot for what must have been another 10 minutes. Maybe longer, maybe less. I don't know, because time inside that mansion was starting to twist like the gnarled branches outside the windows. And as I stood there, clutching the cold wooden sill with white knuckles and lungs that didn't seem to want to work properly, I realized with a deep, gnawing certainty that the house hadn't simply been testing me. It had been learning me, watching the way I flinched when the servant's bell rang, how I rushed past the painting without a word, how I tensed every time footsteps scraped just a little too close behind me, and it was starting to toy with me now, not like a beast that wanted to kill, but like a thing that enjoyed the slow erosion of resolve. And as I forced myself to step away from the window and continue the patrol path laid out for me, I couldn't shake the sensation that something had followed me back from the front door. Something quiet. Something patient. Something that hadn't left at all. The air inside the house had grown thicker since the last time I passed through the central parlor, like the temperature was climbing for no natural reason. Not warm in the way of a furnace or a fire, but humid and suffocating. Like the breath of something monstrous was trapped within the walls and exhaling through the floorboards. And as I walked, I noticed that the shadows were getting longer, even though the lights hadn't changed, stretching unnaturally across the floor and curling up the edges of the walls like black vines. And when I passed the base of the grand staircase again, I swear I saw something. Not movement exactly, but presence. At the top of the steps. Just barely out of sight. Just barely beyond the railing. And though I didn't stop, didn't speak, didn't so much as lift my eyes all the way, I could feel it there, watching me descend into the next room as though I were prey being measured by hunger that had waited centuries to feed again. I was nearing the second dining room when I heard it. A sound so faint and slow that it almost didn't register, except my body knew before my mind did. A whisper of tension along my shoulders and spine that told me something was deeply wrong before I even processed what it was. And then I realized. It was knocking, soft and rhythmic. 3 slow taps coming from somewhere to my right, followed by a fourth one just a second late. Like the person knocking didn't know how doors were supposed to work, and my blood froze completely when I turned my head just enough to identify where it came from, the library door. Rule 1. I stopped walking, just for a breath. Not because I wanted to, but because the knock came again. Tap, 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 and then silence, and then my name. Not shouted, not spoken with urgency. Just whispered, low and delicate, as though whoever or whatever was on the other side didn't want the house to hear them, only me. And it came right through the keyhole, the syllables sliding into my ears like icy fingers. Hey, it's me. Open up. Please. And the worst part wasn't the whisper itself, or even that it knew my name. The worst part was that the voice was familiar. Just familiar enough to make me pause, just close enough to someone I used to know that it stirred some broken piece of memory inside me, like a childhood friend I hadn't seen in years, or a voice from a dream that almost felt real when I woke up. And for the briefest second, I could feel my hand twitching at my side, like some involuntary part of me wanted to reach out and turn the knob, not because I was curious, but because I felt invited. But I remembered the rule. And I clenched my jaw so hard I thought I heard a tooth crack. And I kept walking, faster now, passing the library without a word, ignoring the door as the knocking resumed, louder now, angrier, more urgent. And I heard it whisper again, "Why won't you open it? I'm cold. I remember you. I remember you." And though my legs moved faster, my head stayed forward, and my vision blurred slightly from the sheer effort of pretending it wasn't there. Because if I acknowledged it, if I as much as thought about answering, I didn't know what would come out to greet me. But I knew it wouldn't be something that wore skin properly. Once I reached the next hallway, the knocking stopped, cut off mid-rap like it had realized I was truly gone, and the silence that followed was worse than the noise. It was thick, like the air was waiting for me to stop walking, so it could collapse in on me. And just as I turned the corner, I froze again because the hallway ahead was wrong. It wasn't just darker. It was longer than it had ever been before. Impossibly so, like the house had stretched it while I wasn't looking. And even though I should have been able to see the junction near the kitchen, it was gone, replaced with an endless hallway that pulsed slightly, like the walls were breathing, and the lights above were flickering in a rhythmic pattern, stuttering like a dying heart, and I understood then that I was being herded. I was being led. And the only place this corridor could possibly end now was in the West Wing. The servant's bell hadn't rung since earlier, but somehow that made it worse. It was quiet, too quiet. And the closer I got to the far end, the more I began to hear that silence take on a texture. Like there was a sound behind the quiet, too low to hear directly, but present in a way that made the base of my skull itch. And then, just as I passed the final wall sconce, I heard it again, the bell. 1 ring, then 2, then 3. But this time it didn't stop. It kept ringing. A steady chime, over and over, with no rhythm or purpose. Just an endless, unbroken demand for attention that felt like it was clawing at the inside of my head. And the noise was no longer coming from the West Wing alone. It was coming from every direction, above and below and behind the walls themselves. And it didn't sound like a servant's bell anymore. It sounded like screaming. I staggered back, hands clamped over my ears, and I backed up until I hit a cold surface behind me. A wall, I thought. But it was not the wall, because it was breathing. Slow, wet, breathing. I turned just enough to see what I had touched, and I saw nothing, just the hallway, empty, normal. But the moment I looked forward again, I saw the painting. the same painting from the grand hallway. But I wasn't in the grand hallway anymore. Somehow, impossibly, it had moved. The portrait was hanging at the very end of this wrong hallway now, and the woman inside it had no face anymore, just a blurred, fleshy smear where features used to be. And I understood then that the house was done playing fair, that the rules might still keep me alive, but they wouldn't keep me sane, and that if I wanted to see the dawn, I'd have to do more than follow them. I'd have to endure them, even as they changed, even as they bled, even as they hunted. And somewhere behind me, far, far too close, I heard my name spoken again. But this time, it was my own voice saying it. And it was laughing. It was the sound of my own voice, garbled and wet, slathered in static and echo, as though it had been dragged through a throat that had forgotten how to speak. That rooted me to the floor like my boots had turned to concrete. And every instinct I possessed, every raw nerve still firing in my half-numb body, screamed at me not to turn around, not to look, not to move. Because if I did, if I so much as blinked in the wrong direction, I knew it would be there, smiling with a mouthful of teeth that belonged to me but were bent the wrong way. A doppelganger stitched together from every scream I hadn't let out and every rule I had barely obeyed. And as that voice behind me repeated my name, softer this time, slurred like it was learning how to form it properly, the hallway began to pulse again. Not with light, but with heat. Moist, living heat that oozed down the walls in invisible waves that smelled like old milk and copper and spoiled breath. And the longer I stood still, the more I realized something else was happening. The rules, they were unraveling, or worse, multiplying. Because now, there were doors on either side of the hallway where there hadn't been any before. Long, narrow doors with tiny black knobs that glistened like eyes. And each one was marked with something different. Some had numbers carved into the wood in long, jagged gouges. Others had symbols I couldn't recognize, spirals and crosses and shapes that shifted if I stared too long. And one door, the third one on the left, had my face burned into the wood, not carved, not painted, but burned, as though someone had branded it into the surface with a white-hot iron. And all of them were slightly open. Just a crack. Just enough. The house was done waiting. It wanted me to choose wrong. It needed me to. So I walked, one foot in front of the other, the hallway squirming beneath me, the light above fizzing like it was underwater, and the painting at the end of the corridor didn't move, didn't change, but I could feel the smear of its face twisting in silent laughter as I passed it and reached the branching corridor again, the one that should have taken me to the stairs. But the house had changed it, turned it into something else, something older, and the wallpaper was rotting off the walls now, curling like scorched paper, revealing black brick behind it. The kind of stone that doesn't exist in the real world anymore, slick and oily and ancient. And the ceiling above creaked with the heavy footfalls of something impossibly large pacing just overhead. The footsteps weren't mine. They weren't human. Rule 2 pulsed in my mind like a heartbeat. Do not stop. Do not turn around. Do not acknowledge them. And so I moved faster, pushing forward, arms stiff at my sides, trying not to breathe too loudly, trying not to feel the vibrations of the footsteps that now echoed from the walls themselves. And I was halfway to the staircase when something grabbed my hand. It wasn't cold, it wasn't warm, it was wrong. And when I looked down, there was no hand, no arm, no figure, only the impression of one, like a memory of someone holding me once, that the house had fished from my skull and decided to wear like a glove. And from the darkness to my right, a voice whispered, "You're almost home." And it was my mother's voice, but not quite, too slow, too stretched, like it'd been dragged across a razor blade and glued back together with mucus and grief. And I ripped my hand free and bolted, racing down the hall with no care for silence anymore. No thought of caution, because something was running now too, right behind me. And it was laughing again. But this time it was using every voice I had ever heard in my life, my teachers, my old friends, my own voice layered a dozen times over. It screamed every name I'd ever answered to. And then I reached the staircase. Except it wasn't the staircase. Not anymore. It spiraled down instead of up, and there was no railing, no steps, just a sloping spiral of dirt and stone descending into blackness. And I knew instantly what it was. The basement. where the restroom with the red door was. Rule 5. Only use the one with the red door. And at the bottom of the spiraling passage, I could see a faint red glow, not like a light bulb or a candle, but a heartbeat, pulsing against the walls like the house had grown a second heart down there, and it was trying to lure me to it. I descended, step by breathless step, and the further I went, the wetter the walls became, damp with a sweat that wasn't mine. And I had to duck eventually, the ceiling lowering as the spiral narrowed, until I had to crawl on hands and knees, the red light so bright now it hurt my eyes. And then I saw it, the red door. Exactly as the rule described. Simple, wooden, painted in flaking crimson, with a tarnished brass knob shaped like a clenched fist. But I wasn't alone. There were other doors now too, dozens of them, lining both sides of the corridor, some red, some blue, some white, some black. Each one vibrating, each one whispering, different voices, different versions of me, of people I had known, people who were dead, people who never existed, and I felt them in my mind like ice picks being driven into my skull, begging, pleading, screaming, inviting. Only the correct red door would save me. But which one? They were all red now. Every single one. And I knew, without question, that the wrong one would open into something that had been starving for longer than time, something that had lived inside the bones of the house for centuries, waiting for someone stupid or scared or curious enough to step into the wrong dark. So I closed my eyes, held my breath, and reached for the one closest to the heart of the pulsing glow. I opened it and stepped inside. It was just a bathroom, ordinary, lifeless, dead. But I closed the door behind me and locked it, and as I sat on the floor and waited, the walls around me screamed in frustration. And then slowly, finally, silence, until I heard the front door open again, and a voice, my voice but shredded and hollow, called out from the foyer upstairs. "I see you." And I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't hide. I stood, walked to the tiny slit of a window set into the basement wall, and waited. And then, after 3 eternal minutes, the front door slammed shut again. It left. The house screamed in rage, and then I heard birdsong, faint, far away, dawn. I climbed the stairs slowly, every joint aching like I had aged 20 years in one night. And when I opened the main door, the sun was rising, pale and gold and real. And the fog that had surrounded the mansion was beginning to melt into the hills behind it, and the sky was clear for the first time since I arrived. I stepped outside, shaking, breathing, alive, and behind me the house groaned. Not in pain, but in anticipation, because the rules had been followed, the game had been fair, this time. But I knew, as I walked away, that it was already rewriting itself for the next one, the next guard, the next name, the next voice. And far, far behind me, beyond the hedges and the iron gates, the mansion laughed in my voice once more, and the door opened again.